technological introduction, I am now delighted to warmly welcome excellencies and distinguished representatives to this Asia-Pacific regional consultation hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme. The resolution on mineral resource governance was adopted in 2019 during the 4th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. On behalf of colleagues, I would like to thank you very much for having made the time today to join this consultation. My name is Georgina Lloyd, and I am the Regional Coordinator for Environmental Law and Governance in the Asia-Pacific Regional Office of the United Nations Environment Programme, based here in Bangkok. I'm also the regional focal point for the implementation of this resolution. UNEP is convening these series of virtual consultations at multiple scales. We've had the sub-regional, this is now the regional, and we are going to be having the global consultation. These are being convened in all UNEP regions from July to September this year. As I mentioned, there will also be a global forum later in 2020, where all of the regions will be brought together and updated on the next steps as we prepare for the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly, which is scheduled to be held in February 2021. During today's final regional consultation for Asia and the Pacific, we'll provide an update on the consultation process and the implementation of the resolution. We will also be presenting your feedback on a number of questions related to the governance of minerals in your respective jurisdictions. This feedback is not disaggregated by country and is consolidated based on the 3 sub-regional consultations that have been convened so far for the region. Together, we will ensure that the feedback is correctly reflected in order for us to report back to the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. At the start, I wish to remind you that this consultation is jointly organized by the United Nations Environment Programme and our technical partners, the University of Queensland's Sustainable Minerals Institute. We are also grateful for the generous support of the Government of Switzerland's Federal Office of the Environment for the implementation of this resolution, and to the Government of Mexico, who sponsored this resolution during UNEA 4. Throughout this consultation, we are going to be using the terms Environment Assembly, UNEA 4, and UNEA to refer to UNEP's decision-making body. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to acknowledge that we are hosting these virtual consultations during an extraordinary time when countries across the globe and in our region are fighting a deadly pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic is a global health crisis. It is resulting in significant and far-reaching socio-economic impacts. At UNEP, we remain deeply committed to our core mandate of facilitating global environmental governance by adopting virtual channels to hold discussions. This is because at the end of the day, the health of the people and of the planet are central and are intimately connected. UNEP is committed to working with governments to sustainably recover and build resilience to future crises. The implementation of this resolution on sustainable minerals governance can support the recovery process. I would now like to acknowledge a few key persons that have been involved in the implementation of this resolution. Firstly, as mentioned, the governments of Switzerland and Mexico, represented by Ms. Laura Platschkow and Ms. Gabriela Milan, respectively. Within UNEP, I am pleased to acknowledge Dr. Deshan Sering, the Regional Director of the Asia-Pacific Office, Dijya Noronha, Director of UNEP's Economy Division, Elisa Tonda, Head of the Consumption and Production Unit in UNEP's Economy Division, Saranya Rojanan Yuangit, UNEP's Bangkok Office, Chelsea Roberts, UNEP's Bangkok Office, and Anja Kariuki from UNEP's Law Division. I'm also very pleased to introduce our technical partners, Professor Daniel Franks, who is Program Leader of Governance and Leadership in Mining at the Sustainable Minerals Institute in the University of Queensland, and Julia Keenan, a Research Fellow at the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, also at the University of Queensland. Ladies and gentlemen, At UNEP, we recognize that international cooperation is needed to resolve governance issues in the extractive industries. Through the UNEA 4 resolution that we are discussing, UNEP was requested to collect best practices about the challenges and difficulties, and also make an assessment about possible ways of how best to govern mineral resources and extraction. This work is important, and it will lead towards a report that can provide the basis for the next steps at the next UNEA in 2021. During the sub-regional consultations that have been held, we've heard your insights, your experience, and your knowledge about the difficulties, challenges, but also about best practices and success stories in the governance of minerals across our region. So before we begin, we will hear further about these experiences and these stories. I will quickly provide an overview of this afternoon's consultation. First, we will go through the consolidated feedback that has been received from the sub-regional consultations that were held on the 29th, 30th, and 31st of July. As you will recall, this feedback centers on the 3 questions that were posed to participants, and this will be shared again for further reflections during the consultation today. We're then going to have an open discussion using both the chat function, which you can access through this platform, as well as oral interventions. You can send a message in the chat box if you would wish to take the floor. I will then call on you to request access to the microphone, as was described by Arnold previously. As we do have interpreters today assisting us, please do ensure that you switch on your camera when you do make your intervention, as this will make their lives and their work easier. If raising a question or comment, either over the chat function or through the microphone, please state your question concisely and clearly, include your name and your organization. We will try to address as many questions as possible and hear as many contributions as we can today. After these contributions, we are then going to close the meeting with information on next steps and feedback options. Please do note that today our consultation is being recorded. So with this introduction, I would like to check whether there are any questions or clarifications before we move on to the presentation of the feedback from the sub-regional consultations. If you do have any questions, please do use the chat function. I do not see at the moment that we have received any questions so far, but at any time throughout the session, please do not hesitate to add any questions you might have. Before we can continue, I will remind you that if you have any technical issues, please do use the operator tab in the chat box to note any technical issues that you may have, and they will be responded to. So let me now pass over to Professor Daniel Franks from the University of Queensland for a summary of the sub-regional consultations and the process going forward. Professor Franks, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgie. Excellencies, distinguished representatives, ladies and gentlemen, in this session, I'll present a summary of the Asia-Pacific sub-regional consultations, which have been conducted over the past month. Environment and mining ministries across the region were invited to participate in the consultations, as well as stakeholders from industry, academia, CSOs, NGOs, with an interest in the region. The events were well attended. Collectively, we had over 70 participants from several different countries in the region. We were able to have a pretty wide-ranging discussion via direct intervention from the participants in the plenary sessions, as well as lots of substantive comments in the chat function. So really looking forward to that continuing today. We invited and received submissions through email and an online survey. We're also welcoming any video submissions of not more than 3 minutes be sent to us on the GGKP email address, which you can receive from your invitations, or later it will be added to the chat box function. These feedback options remain open until the 28th of August, when we'll incorporate them into today's discussion for reporting within a global report. We asked 3 questions to be considered of participants. These are the main questions that we're looking to seek consultation on through the UNEA process. There are many more sub-questions that are also in the discussion paper, which you should have also received, that we're looking to receive feedback on. These 3 main questions will now be posted in the chat box to remind you for today's discussion. Please allow me the opportunity to provide a short summary of each of the 3 main questions and the responses we received during the sub-regional consultations. In the session following, we'd like to hear your feedback on whether these points raised during the sub-regional consultations capture the most important aspects in your particular context, or whether there's anything further to add to these, or if you want to note something that's missing from the discussion to date. So we're essentially starting from the base of the sub-regional consultations and then building on that today during this regional consultation. In response to the first question on the most pressing mineral governance challenges raised in the consultation, participants shared the following. Participants discussed regulatory capture as one of the first challenges. The participants from a number of countries suggested that regulatory capture is a significant barrier to the improvement of mining governance and the oversight of existing regulation. Participants noted that a number of factors compromise policy development and effective regulation, including when elected leaders are either beneficial owners of mining companies or their electoral campaigns are financed by mining projects or mining companies. Second, participants mentioned options for improving corporate accountability. Despite a range of examples of harm caused by mining projects, there is a lack of public understanding about the accessibility or accountability of any mechanisms for handling grievances. There's no broad consensus on minimum environmental and social standards, and remedy is often inadequate. So questions were raised about grievance handling mechanisms, and for example, about what happens when a company violates human rights. In what cases would a permit be suspended or cancelled? So what is the follow-on from a grievance? The third issue that was raised by delegates is something that we've heard from around other regions as well, but it's also pronounced in the Asia Pacific region, and that is the shrinking of the civil space and community participation in issues related to extractives. Participants expressed concerns about the shrinking space and the marginalisation of some communities and advocates, and their inability to articulate and challenge and resist mining projects that threaten their rights without having a response to that. Global Witness, for example, recently documented threats and harm to land and environmental defenders in the Asia and Pacific in a recent report, and that triggered a number of representatives in our consultations to raise similar issues. The majority of these threats and harm are located in the extractive industries, according to the Global Witness report, and often the current mineral governance frameworks are considered ineffective or insufficient for considering those issues, particularly those issues around impact on communities or artisanal and small-scale mining, issues around accountability, community participation in governance, and in particular Indigenous people rights and access to land and resources, FPIC, intergenerational equity, etc. Participants raised that attention needs to be given to the role of intermediaries and independent observers in improving transparency and disclosure of risks and impacts. The fourth issue that was raised was on the re-evaluation of the social contract for mining. Attitudes toward mining, along with technological developments, are changing, and therefore the social contract is also changing. So there is a reduced tolerance for environmental damage, social harm, and worker exploitation. But at the same time, the calls for benefit sharing, avoidance of harm, and access to remedy are increasing. With technological change, particularly automation of mining and mineral processing, that's leading to relocation of workforce and skills, meaning the flows of employment benefits are no longer as pronounced, or potentially won't be as pronounced in the future at that local level. So the cost and benefit equation is changing. Participants encouraged a really holistic understanding of how mining is part of local, national and global development agendas, and a full cost accounting that includes intergenerational equity. The fifth issue that was raised is the ineffective local development strategies. In many Asian countries, significant foreign investment in mining is present, and participants noted that some countries lack the policies and capacity to support local value addition and business development, and they see this as a lost opportunity. The sixth issue is on the emerging issue of deep sea minerals. It's a particular challenge for governance in the region, and the Pacific and Island territories are now considering deep sea minerals as a prospect. And there is a need to build, they're seeing it as a prospect because there's a need to build more resilience in their economies due to, for example, downturns in tourism from COVID-19, etc. But there's a lack of legislation or policy to govern that extraction at the moment, and participants did raise the ongoing processes at the International Seabed Authority that are considering environmental regulation at the present. The seventh challenge is around informal mining, artisanal and small-scale mining, and in particular that of development minerals, which are minerals and materials that are mined, processed and used domestically, really construction materials and industrial minerals. Participants raised the variety of challenges that relate to informal artisanal mining, particular reference to development minerals, and these being different to many of the challenges associated with large-scale mining or the mining of metals. They include challenges around formalisation, regulation, the appropriate regulatory authority. For a lot of countries, the regulation of these minerals is left out of Mineral Acts. And the particular issues around climate change adaptation and infrastructure development, given that these minerals are really important for construction and reconstruction. There's a really great discussion about the role of development minerals in disaster response and the gap in current disaster preparedness that considers the role of construction materials, often the most important commodity to be used in the reconstruction effort. The final challenge that was raised by participants was on tailings safety and environmental impact. Obviously, we have the new global tailings standards, so that was a stimulus to many of the discussions. There are long-standing issues related to poor mine tailings management and remediation in the Asia-Pacific region. There was lots of examples of poor practice in management that was raised, and that communities and environmental advocates continued to be negatively impacted. Participants were cautiously optimistic about the global tailings standard, but were still asking questions about its implementation. I'll now move on to the second question, which was around the good and best practices that were raised by participants to inspire sustainable and responsible development of the extraction, use and management of minerals. There were lots of good practices shared in the area. There was the example of Telangana in India has an interesting way of dealing with sand extraction, where river extraction is auctioned off. Extractors must deliver the sand to government sand depots, and users book sand online, and it's delivered by registered trucks to the user's site. So this ensures there's a traceable system, and it's resulted in a significant amount of increase in the amount of revenue for the government in accessing this sand, which is sovereign wealth of the country. The Goenchi Mato movement in India talked about reconceptualizing the mineral ownership of mineral resources. There was also discussion about the creation of multi-partite monitoring teams that can involve civil society organizations and subnational governments in monitoring efforts. There was best practices shared about mandatory social development and environmental protection and enhancement funds. There was discussions about different types of rehabilitation funds for mine site decommissioning and rehabilitation. We also had some best practice examples from Thai government that was sharing the new Mineral Act, where by mining was only permitted in particular zones that are delineated by the National Mineral Management Policy Commission. There was a range of best practices shared by the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, particularly the Regional Environmental Program, where they're conducting environmental impact assessment training and trying to boost the approval process capacity around environmental impact assessments. Some countries were also talking about a registration system for environmental impact assessment consultants, and in particular in Australia, the Australian Institute for Mining and Metallurgy is talking about a new process for registration of social practitioners that they are implementing. The Secretariat of the Pacific Community Regional Environmental Program is also working with countries to plan out mining guidelines for approval processes and in particular EIA guidelines to strengthen decision making. Finally, in the Pacific, we had a good conversation about the reuse of tailings waste material as construction materials and the Waigani Convention that controls the transport of hazardous waste and potential reform of that convention or amendment so that it might be able to permit the recycling and circular economy of some mining waste material that's benign that could be used in reconstruction. Finally, I know this has been a comprehensive summary. We now move on to the concrete actions that delegates and participants raised. And this is for potential work for the international community and international cooperation. The first action that was suggested was around how mining can improve the raw materials needed for the clean energy future and what might be needed to have governance of that process. Participants also suggested a potential limit to the quantum of mining in relation to known reserves. So making sure that depletion of minerals is not apparent for future generations. There was some conversation about whether UNEA might consider actively recommending some minimum standards around mineral resource governance in the spirit of, for example, the International Labour Organization's standards. On social regulation, there was talk about direct legal remedy against investors, for example, arbitration or in multilateral investment courts, if one does eventuate. There were some suggestions around working with industry, particularly small-scale gold processors on developing circular economy approaches. And there is also, we've heard in other consultations around the links to the Minamata Convention and the capacity building associated with that in the reduction of mercury. There was a discussion about the actions needed to improve dialogue between different stakeholders and improve transparency and accountability. We talked about how to understand the reality of this COVID-19 pandemic and how that might impact land use change and particular the increased mineral extraction that might be associated. We also talked about the potential for tailings reuse and the management of mining waste and the strengthening of community consultations. Finally, we talked about harmonisation of existing mining laws and policies, and in particular, we talked about the strengthening of guidelines for extraction and dredging of sand and aggregates. Ladies and gentlemen, they were incredibly rich conversations we had at the sub-regional level. We have high expectations for your contributions today. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll now transfer back to Georgina. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Daniel, for that very detailed summary that really captured the discussions that we had across the sub-regional consultations. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard these salient issues that have emanated from these sub-regional consultations, and we are now going to turn to the floor for your feedback on this summary that Daniel has provided. So I want to ask you, is this a true reflection of the governance issues in Asia Pacific? Is this comprehensive and sufficient to be reported back to the UN Environment Assembly? If anything, what is missing from this summary? Are there governance gaps that have not yet been mentioned? Are there some that need to be further reinforced? Also, are there additional good or best practices that must be included? So please do not hesitate to please ask for the floor. You can ask for the floor through the chat box. And once you've asked for the floor, you can request the mic. And once you are given the mic, I will invite you to make an intervention. We really do want to hear from you. It's really important that the input that you give will enrich the report that is provided to UNEA 5. So please do request to make an intervention. Note that when you are invited to make an intervention, remember to unmute your microphone and switch on your camera so that the interpreters can also interpret appropriately. So with that, I would like to now provide the opportunity for individuals to request through the chat function to supplement the information that has been provided by Professor Franks. I understand that we do have a couple of individuals that have asked to take the floor. And if I can please invite those individuals to request the microphone through the Kudo platform. You should see that button on the bottom right of your screen. So just while we wait for individuals to be given access to the microphone, please do continue to add any comments you might have through the chat function as well, because all of those comments will also be incorporated into the final report that is given to the next session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. So with that, I would now like to invite Tawatchai to please make an intervention. The floor is yours. Please do unmute and turn on your camera.
Hi. Did you hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. We can hear you.
My name is Hochai. I'm from DMR, the Department of Mineral Resources of Thailand. And I just would like to join this meeting to hear what's going on about the resource governance. And right now, I don't have any further comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that comment. So I do have a question that has been posed that perhaps Professor Franks would like to respond to. Some of the issues that have been raised in the sub-regional consultations included, as you had mentioned, issues around seabed mining and participation of community members in minerals extractives industries. So I want to ask Professor Franks to please reinforce what are the significance of these issues for this region in particular. Why have these particular issues been raised in Asia Pacific, and what are the similarities to some of the other regions? Thank you.
Thanks, Georgie. Yes, the issue of deep sea minerals is of particular relevance to the Pacific region because the geological resources that are being targeted for the extraction of minerals from the seafloor are very present in the Pacific region. It's the region that is attracting the most interest from mining companies looking to exploit those resources. There's a number of different types of resources ranging from seabed nodules to massive sulfides. They're from different geological settings in the ocean floor, but nonetheless still very prominent in the Pacific region. There's been a discussion about the potential for the extraction of these resources for a long period of time. I remember when I first studied geology 25 years ago, we looked at, in one of our lectures, particularly manganese nodules and their potential for extraction. And one of the books I was using at that time to do that learning was 20 years old already, right? So this has been an issue that's been discussed for a very long time. I think certainly in the last 10 years, there's been more activity around it. The activity has waxed and waned. It's increased and lessened over that period, depending on different trends and cycles. But we do have a concerted effort at the moment to strengthen the governance situation around the mining of minerals from the seafloor. That is located in the International Seabed Authority, which is physically located in Jamaica, and they're currently discussing environmental regulations. So it is a topic that's of enormous relevance. Now, there are impacts, obviously, on the ocean environment that need to be regulated and managed, but there are also impacts associated with social impacts for communities and workers that might be located adjacent to or near extraction locations. So just like offshore oil and gas has social impacts back onshore, where the workforce is located and where economic activity to support the industries is located, it's the same that is true of the potential to mine the seafloor. There is also the added implication of how environmental impacts on the seafloor might impact the ecosystems and fisheries that communities rely on. So we've certainly in the sub-regional consultations heard quite a bit of interest from civil society groups, from local community representatives about this topic. So I'd encourage more discussion on that today. If I'll take the opportunity, Georgina, another issue that I think is acutely an issue in the Asia-Pacific region that we'd certainly love some more guidance on and some more ideas on is related to the extraction of sand from perennial rivers. So perennial river is a river that's always flowing, and the extraction of sand from perennial rivers, sand and gravel, tends to have very acute impacts on those ecosystems. It tends to also be very mixed in terms of its regulation and governance in the Asia-Pacific region, and there are quite significant impacts on quite a few rivers from over-extraction of sand. It causes sedimentation downstream, which can cause issues for fisheries and local environments, but also for the quality of drinking water, and it can cause erosion upstream due to sand extraction as well. The challenges around sand extraction were a big part of the study that was conducted by the Secretary of the Pacific Community and United Nations Development Program as part of the ACP EU Development Minerals Program that I used to lead at UNDP. And there's quite a lot of issues related to the extraction of sand and gravel from those rivers. But countries like Fiji, for example, are looking to transition from river gravel extraction to hard rock quarrying extraction. So there's lots of potential alternatives to that kind of sand extraction because we can crush stone to make manufactured sand, which can be a high quality product for use, for example, in road building or infrastructure, therefore getting greater longevity out of that infrastructure because the quality of the sand material is better. So lots of issues there, but really love to hear your views on what action can be taken. And in relation to that topic or any other topic, we would love to hear about what international cooperation could be useful in the topic. There's lots that has come out about what we can do at the state and regional and local levels. What can we do at the international level between different countries, different governments, different institutions to address these issues? I'll now hand back over to you, Georgie. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much again, Daniel. So with that, we now have a couple of other speakers who have requested to make interventions. I'm first going to pass to Jim O'Brien to make an intervention on sand. So Jim, the floor is yours. Please unmute and turn on your camera. So I understand there was a little bit of a technical glitch there. So Jim, please, if you're available to take the floor, please unmute and turn on your microphone. Turn on your camera, please. Thank you. So I think first we will pass to our next speaker, and then we'll come back to Jim. Rahul from the Goa Foundation, please, the floor is yours.
Share a screen.
Thank you, Rahul. We can hear you and see you.
Okay, thanks. And I'm from the Goa Foundation. We're an environmental non-profit in India. We've sent in a representation which is slightly unusual. So I just want to talk about our 7 recommendations to the UNEP. And some of these have been brought up already in the previous conversations, and Daniels did mention them. But I do want to take the chance to just re-emphasize some of the very important things which are different from the traditional ones. The first is we believe that the intergenerational equity principle must be foundational, not just for mineral management or natural resource management, but for civilization as a whole. Intergenerational equity is a simple concept. What we inherit, we have to pass on to the next generation, either in the same form or transformed into other wealth. And any family, society, civilization, humanity which does not follow this rule will eventually finish off its entire resource base, and that will collapse. And we can see that is happening today with, let's say, the climate change or the way we're trashing the oceans. So the first recommendation is UNEP should put this at the center of its mineral governance, resource governance, resolution, or maybe amended, in fact, at the UNEA. The second recommendation we have is that we need to think about minerals itself differently. Classically, we've been thinking of minerals as a windfall, and then when we sell minerals and get royalty, we call that revenue. And this creates windfall revenue, which is basically a paradigm where you take the minerals out as quickly as you can and treat it like a lottery. You spend the money and it's all gone. But when you look from an intergenerational equity standpoint, basically future generations are going to get neither the minerals nor its value. So we are arguing for a change in paradigm. We need to think about minerals as a shared inheritance. Now, this windfall revenue paradigm comes from the way governments have traditionally treated royalty. All governments call royalty as revenue or a tax or earnings or income. And even on this call, Daniel earlier on talked about resource revenue. We argue that is actually not only wrong, it is misleading everybody. All we're doing is selling our wealth. And this change in thinking is fixed because the IMF's accounting standard for governments for royalties calls it as rent, which is part of revenue. It's actually not part of tax. But unless IMF itself changes the standard, any amount of discussion on this point will not happen. So we request the UNEP to make a recommendation to the IMF to change the the government finance statistics manual. Linked to this is the idea that governments or various levels of governments only hold minerals in trust for the people and future generations. It is not the proprietary asset of the government. So let me take deep sea minerals as an example. Under the UNCLOS, the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, the UNCLOS basically says that deep sea minerals are held by the International Seabed Authority on behalf of humankind. It's a common heritage of humankind. But when minerals are going to be sold, the first dibs are going to go to the ISA, who obviously then wants to extract more and more so they can create a bigger bureaucracy. And then it's going to be spread around and everybody will get little bits of it. Our point of view is different. This is the wealth which belongs not just to us but to all future generations, and governments or anybody dealing with it cannot treat it as their own wealth. They have to treat it as wealth held in trust. We sent in a very detailed framework in terms of how we should look at minerals, but I'm just going to look at a very quick, short 5 principles. First is minerals belong to everybody with the state as the trustee. Secondly, we have an obligation to make sure minerals or their value reaches future generations. When we are mining, we're effectively selling our wealth, so we must ensure zero loss. Whatever we receive, we must save for future generations. We are recommending a future generations fund like Norway. And finally, we own the minerals, we own the fund, we own the income from the fund. The logical thing to do is to distribute it as a dividend to everybody equally. We get it today, future generations will get it when they are born. If you think about, again, deep sea minerals, the same thing. ISA should ensure zero loss. The entire money from extraction should go into a global sovereign wealth fund. And then the income, the real income, should be distributed to every person on the planet. The last thing I want to talk about is, and this is something that hasn't actually come through quite clearly, is that if we are protecting this wealth, we need, in our opinion, 4 key things to be done. First is, it should be a legal goal in every mining law that zero loss is the goal. There should not be any loss, waste, or consumption of the wealth. How do you implement zero loss? Well, think about Fort Knox. They manage gold. Gold is effectively a mineral. We dig it out and put it into another hole. But we have an extremely high security apparatus for Fort Knox. But why don't we have it for the mineral supply chain? We need it for every bit of minerals because that is our wealth. And if we don't have a high security mineral supply chain, it will get stolen. Similarly, if you think about the financial sector, anybody who has stolen wealth will never be allowed to be employed in a bank or a mutual fund or handling wealth again. But we have examples around the world where extractors have flouted laws and have stolen wealth, and yet they're eligible to become contractors or extractors in other parts of the world. How does this happen? If we do it in the financial sector, we should be doing it here. The World Bank has come out with a manual to implement this, for countries to implement this. It's called License to Drill. It goes beyond fit and proper person tests and deals with a lot of the governance issues. And last and most important, we are all mineral owners, so we have an obligation to make sure future generations inherit what we did. Therefore, we need access to all the information required so that we can personally ensure that this has happened, which requires radical transparency, and it also requires seeing extractors as basically outsourcers. All they're doing is converting our mineral wealth into another form of wealth. As extractors and outsourced partners, we have a right to demand full transparency from them in every single aspect. Because if there is any loss, we are responsible. We have to make sure this does not happen. Thank you, Georgina. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Rahul, for that intervention. I would now also like to call upon the Australian Department of Industry and Science to please make an intervention. The floor is yours.
Hello, thank you. I hope everyone can hear me. Just a general comment from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources. Thank you to Mr. Daniel Franks on providing the overview of the findings. We'd just like to sort of reiterate that Australia is a global leader in the ethical and environmentally responsible supply of resources. For us, for Australia, responsible mining sort of means commitment to safety, secure supply chains, and world-leading environmental practices. Australian companies and projects strive to meet the best practice standards and have a world-leading reputation for commodity development. So we support and promote a sound mining sector governance globally, including approaches to achieving a level playing field of standards for all producers, sharing best practices with developing countries to deliver diversified, sustainable and ethical supply chains, and deliver improved outcomes across the supply chain from mapping of mineral resources and extraction through to mine closure and reclamation of tailings. The increasing use of technologies, especially for renewable energy, electric vehicles and battery storage technologies, will continue to drive unprecedented demand for resources. In addition, there is a growing approach among investors and customers to source responsibly in supply chains. There are a number of global initiatives in this space, as I think everyone knows, and we see this work as a valuable activity to understand different governance initiatives and gaps, as well as challenges in this space. And the work, including the implementation of this resolution, can also help countries to boost trade, create jobs, and increase competition and choice. So we're all very supportive from the Department of Industry, Energy, Science and Resources. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that very enlightening intervention. And I would now like to give the floor to Jim O'Brien. Jim, the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning. Sorry, a few moments ago I just could not switch on the mic or the video camera, but now we seem to have solved that glitch. Jim O'Brien is my name. I'm convener or president, if you like, of the Global Aggregates Information Network, which we call GAIN. We are a voluntary coalition of all the major aggregates associations of the world, and we have strong representation in Asia through China, Japan, India is coming into it, Malaysia, and we're developing links in several other countries. But we represent, and I emphasize, the responsible aggregates industry. And perhaps I should explain, aggregates is the broader term covering all types of crushed rock, sand and gravel, marine aggregates and recycled aggregates. So there's a broad spectrum, and sand is just one small part of that. As I say, we very strongly promote the responsible extraction of aggregates of all kinds. Generally, it is from hard rock quarries, which extract and crush and screen and produce the aggregates, which are then sold for very essential construction activity. Sand and gravel can be extracted from sand and gravel pits. Most of these are on dry land. Some are in rivers. And when it comes to that, to do that responsibly, it requires very careful environmental impact study of the rivers concerned. And it can be done responsibly, provided it's not exceeding the natural sedimentation replenishment and not damaging, of course, any of the river infrastructure itself or the biodiversity or other hydraulic flow aspects of the river. And indeed, it can actually help to reduce flooding simply because you're allowing greater flow of the river, and actually providing some temporary storage in case of flooding in some cases. So there's a much broader picture than probably was depicted in the UNEP report, though we do welcome it. We are very strongly committed to sustainable extraction and really want ourselves to help in phasing out and eliminating the illegal extraction, which greatly damages the reputation of the industry in general. And so we have been working where we can influence things in different countries. We have made partnerships or communications with various bodies. And there are some excellent case studies coming out. India was already mentioned, and we have some case studies, for example, of the state of Telangana, which has very strongly acted against illegal sand extraction and now is replacing that, what we call, by manufactured sands. These are the fine material left over from crushed rock production. So that's a moving away from natural sand, and that can be done in many different places and is very much the focus of the future. Equally, in Malaysia, for example, some rivers around Selangor near Kuala Lumpur, there have been excellent case studies and which won awards of the very close study of the river
My
there.
question is related to environmental impact assessment.
Yes. Can I just finish first, please? In China as well, it's acting very strongly to eliminate illegal extraction from its rivers. And Colombia is another example of really where they have a very big problem in getting access to crushed rock quarries. They have to extract from rivers, but they really developed best practice in doing that. And our GAIN network has helped in bringing the best practice from all parts of the world. So overall, the story is, I think there is more appreciation around the world of the undesirability of irresponsible extraction. We're working to help that. We see the way forward as really for the UN and its UNEP to bring more continued pressure on governments to address this problem. There are several countries in Southeast Asia that have reduced bans on export of sand, and that is great. But more needs to be done, and that's what I asked through this venue, is to keep UNEP to keep pressurizing the governments in those areas. And it really comes back to very strong law enforcement. This illegal activity of sand extraction is, as the report says, very much mafia-like and is very difficult to tackle, but it can be done with the strong resolution of the government, and we're delighted to help in that. I think modern technology can play a greater role to assist governments, such as satellite imaging and use of drones can spot the illegal activity, and of course greatly help those in the responsible industry to do it more effectively and to be even better performers in the future. And we fully support the thrust of the UNEP report and the idea that was mentioned earlier by Danielle of a quality mark. That also is an excellent idea, where sand and gravel and crushed rock extracted responsibly should perhaps deserve a quality mark of responsible extraction. So thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm sorry I didn't get the question that was being put, but it was, I think, about environmental impact assessment. Yes, of course, it must be done. And we have very good examples where that is done, and indeed always done in cases where extraction is responsibly permitted. I hope that answers and is putting our case, if you like. We've support responsible extraction, and just to emphasize that aggregates are absolutely essential to the resilience and future construction and growing population and whatever effects climate change do have. actually further increase the need for aggregates in the future. So thank you very much for that offer to intervene. Thank you indeed.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that intervention, and I'm glad that we could make the technical aspects work as well. So now I would like to call on Mr. Suwa to ask his question and make his intervention. Suwa, please do unmute and turn on your camera. Thank you very much. Thank you, Suwa. I can now see you and hear you.
Yes. Hello. Can I speak?
Yes, please do pose your question.
Yeah, my question is related to environmental impact assessment. Environmental impact assessment that is a draft recently India government prepared, and it is now open for a public consultation. So my question that India government opened this environmental impact assessment during the lockdown time. So for the public consultation, means say if I am interested, if I should make comment, if I want to participate in the process of public consultation, then how can I make my comment or can give my suggestion on the draft that is opened for the public consultation without a physical visit of the site of the project, where the site of project is opened for the public consultation. So during the lockdown time, why did India government open this kind of very important kind of environmental impact assessment draft for public consultation? That is my question, that how we tackle this issue, because environmental impact assessment is not a kind of a very one-step process, just a click and just a word. Not. We have to go through the visit, we have to go through the observation also, the field visit, mountain, forest, coastal region. It's very difficult in the lockdown time also to visit the site. So how we solve this issue, how we tackle the issue, that our comment, our opinion really reflect in the draft. So I don't know who will give me answer of this, but I asked to I'm putting this question before Daniel France. I think he can answer me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question, and I would now like to give the floor to Daniel to respond. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgina, and also thank you for the question. Now, I don't think I'm going to be able to answer your question specifically related to the motivations of the Indian government in allowing an impact assessment to go to public consultation during the lockdown period. But I think there's relevance to what you've raised in terms of how we, in all of the different regions that we come from, how we view the changes in governance that might be required in this context of a global pandemic, and what are the implications for the public discussion, the public approval processes, the environmental impact assessment processes that are associated with large-scale developments. And I don't think it's just the mineral sector. And we know that in some countries, COVID-19, the mineral sector has been identified as a kind of a key post-pandemic part of the economy that can stimulate economic activity, so that there's lots of efforts to streamline, etc. But it's also the fact that infrastructure and the stimulus provided by infrastructure developments is likely to be a big part of the post-COVID economic so-called recovery, right? So I think there are big questions there about if we've got large-scale major projects, whether they're mineral projects or infrastructure projects. Those infrastructure projects require minerals to be built, like Jim just mentioned in his excellent intervention. Then we are really faced with a different context for public participation. Now, are the tools that we have at our disposal, are they adequate to undertake public consultation for impact assessment or other forms of approval processes or governance processes? Are they adequate in this new context? It's an open question, right? So what do we currently use? Well, typically companies and governments will use information, so leaflets, fact sheets. They'll produce scientific studies that can be assessed by experts and communities, and then send in submissions maybe through email or postal or other. So maybe those kind of activities are likely to continue. But the questioner did raise the fact of not being able to visit sites and really getting a feeling for context. But there's a whole host of other techniques like community town hall meetings, like face-to-face meetings, like having the interactions that can't really be replaced often by virtual formats. So we are holding this UNEA process in a virtual context where otherwise it probably would have been done face-to-face, right? But and it does create some opportunity because more people can participate, but more of a particular type of person, right? So there's lots of other people that don't have the means to access virtual forms of communication. So how do we do that? Is there a way of empowering local community members who do have large access to mobile phones to get involved? I know that there's a few different technology platforms out there that use mobile phones for grievance handling and also for public participation in impact assessment processes. Could those be used as alternatives to face-to-face meetings? They're broader questions that I don't think we have the answers for right now, but certainly interested in the question and also any other interventions on that particular topic, which is a pretty interesting one. Thank you, Georgina.
Thank you very much for that response, Daniel. So I would like to now respond to, there's a question that has been posed in the chat, and I would like to request any of our government counterparts that are on this call, if they would like to respond to this, on deep sea mining. And the questions are, do participants see potential for international bodies such as UNEA to play a complementary role to the current process at the International Seabed Authority, especially as regards the environmental dimension? And further, to what extent is ISA globally representative? So I would like to invite any of the government reps that we have and others on this call to please respond to those questions. I also see that Jane has requested to make an intervention. Jane, on the bottom corner of your screen, can you click on the blue request to speak button, and then we can give you the opportunity to make an intervention. And again, I would like to just reiterate that we do welcome interventions by all of the participants to this call. Please do not hesitate to request to make an intervention, and we will give you the opportunity. So with that, I would now like to give the floor to Jane. Jane, please do unmute and turn on your camera. Thank you.
Hello?
Hello, yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, thanks. Yes, I'm Jane Lingbawan from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industries and Energy. As the organization suggests, I am an indigenous people, member of the indigenous people here in the Philippines. And when it comes to natural management of minerals, the indigenous peoples had been, and I know it's already a common knowledge that indigenous peoples has their own indigenous natural management of their resources, including, of course, mineral. Um, when we talk about governance in mineral extraction, first, in the perspective of the indigenous peoples, they should be given first a full recognition, full respect as indigenous peoples, because we without that, if they don't do that in action, yeah, I know that they've been saying that we respect indigenous peoples, we respect their culture and all that, their way of life, but then in action it's not happening, especially on ground zero. So I would like to reiterate that, because if that is not happening, all other unfavorable events or injustices to indigenous peoples happens if it's not really implemented. So with that, I would like to also thank you, no, for the sharing of the sub-regional results consultation. And I see that in the perspective of the indigenous peoples, I see many of these issues raised during the sub-regional are also our issues as indigenous peoples. So one, the first is I go with that, the regulation. It should be strictly implemented, no? Because without regulation, everything is not will be in chaos, especially in the ground on the ground. And of course, the transparency and other more, no, the benefit sharing, the equity, and of course, the very important one also is the accountability. That's very important because as of now, because of responsible mining that's happening not only in the Philippines but also in other in the indigenous peoples territory in Asia, that many are destroyed, no, because of the tailings dams and other waste materials of the mining, and then mountains collapse and landslide are there because of the mining activities in the past or at the present. That's a very irresponsible, so accountability is very important also. uh, and then of course, one is the um yeah, because of this irresponsible lack of transparency, not no regulation at all. Of course, the people will oppose that, especially indigenous peoples, because they don't also benefit in those extractive activities by corporations, and of course with the permission of the government involved. So with when the indigenous peoples oppose those projects, there comes the various human rights violations that are being inflicted to them. So those are the and I think it's already a public knowledge that indigenous peoples are really being oppressed because of these extractive industry or activities in their territories. So with that, actually, we have also a good practice in that, but maybe it's very long to share in this. But the gist of that good practice that we do, especially here in the Philippines, is the small scale mining that we do is run and managed by the community through a cooperative. And also in this cooperative, all people involved or the community people are members to this cooperative, including the support of the local government unit also, uh, as part of the labor force or the management also of this small scale mining. So and then regulations is very strict, no. So like you have to have this kind of size of the tunnel, and then you should replace tree, whatever tree that you cut, you should replace it for how many trees. It's a constant activities that is in the policy and regulations. I mean, of this, and those are just an example. But then the very important thing here is that it's being regulated strictly. The people are benefiting from this, and then they also give benefits to the local government unit involved, like through taxes. Uh, those are the things that I can say about good practice. And then as a recommendations, IPNI, my organization, uh, would like to recommend this. I would like to. I will go with the recommendation of India about intergenerational equity, because we are not only thinking of today, but we are also thinking of tomorrow, and in the future for the coming generations. So intergenerational equity also is good, and we would like to support that. And then, of course, the strict implementation of the FPIC, the free prior informed consent, especially because we are indigenous peoples, and we have our own culture, our own way of protecting our resources, the land and territory. So the consent of the people should be really given freely, and then the strict regulations, of course, of if it's given, if the consent is given, there should be a strict regulations really that has to be agreed upon by of course the community people affected, and then the state, the government, and then the corporations, and then the finance. And then of course the transparency also, that should be reiterated. Every aspect of the projects of the should be known to the people, especially the affected one. And then there should be no anomalies being done when giving all this information. It should be very really true information, whether it's positive or negative impact or effect of this project. And then the full respect, I'm again saying that it should be uh, again and again reiterated that the full respect to IPs, to indigenous peoples and local communities, decision and views on these projects should be fully given. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jane, for that intervention. And can we please ask if you would be willing to submit those examples of best practices or good practices, if you could submit those in writing to us as well, to ensure that they are fully captured in the report. So thank you very much. I would also now like to invite any of the participants that have recently joined the consultation, that we really do welcome any inputs that you may have on anything that you would like to reinforce for core issues in the Asia Pacific region in the governance of extractives. I would also like to further discuss one of the key issues that has been raised, and that is of sand mining. And we have received a question around this, which was, can you highlight the possibilities that might be available in the future to replace sand or to work as a sand alternative? And if I may ask Professor Franks to please respond to that question, and then we will continue with the further interventions. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you, Georgie. I'm happy to answer this question, but also maybe invite Jim in the chat box if he'd like to answer as well, because his depth of knowledge on this topic is very large. So would love to take advantage of that. So there's a few different ways in which we can think of the sand and construction materials, so sand, gravel, aggregates, in the context of a circular economy. So we can look to find alternate sources of sand from the natural environment. So instead of dredging sand or extracting gravel from rivers in contexts where that isn't ecologically the right thing to do in that particular location, we might look at using aggregate materials and hard rock quarries as construction materials. As Jim mentioned earlier, crushed stone can be used is used in lots of circumstances for construction materials. And you can even create manufactured sand, which is crushing that stone to the size fraction that is sand. So a lot of people don't realize, but sand is not actually a mineral. Sand is the grain size of an aggregate of minerals. Now, natural sand in beaches and rivers, it tends to break, the erosion processes tend to break down a lot of the minerals that normally form in the soil profile or that are eroded. So by the time you get to rivers, a lot of the concentration of that sand material ends up being quartz. So quartz is a common mineral in sand, but sand just really refers to the size fraction that is larger than silt but smaller than gravel and cobbles, etc. So you can create sand out of any mineral substance or aggregate substance. Now, you might need particular mineralogy for particular circumstances, so you want to make sure that that's the case, right? And there are lots of different international standards for that. Another thing that we might do is we might look at other waste streams. So instead of taking from the natural environment, we might look at waste streams that could provide alternatives to natural sand. So some of those waste streams might be, like I mentioned earlier, tailings. So tailings is the leftover mineral waste after mineral processing from mining. Typically, that mineral waste is just crushed up rock, right? Now, it may contain some hazardous minerals within it. A lot of metal mines will have sulfide minerals left in their tailings, and those sulfide minerals can mobilize metals into the environment, right? So there's a need to make sure that that tailings material is benign and doesn't contain those elements that can be mobilized into waterways and affect the ecosystem, right? But there are lots of tailings that either can be processed further to get a benign material or are already benign that could be reused in construction or land reclamation or land building, right? So there's a huge proportion of the sand market is actually for reclaiming land, particularly in places like Singapore, for example. So we might reuse that tailings material. There is a huge amount of work that needs to be done to look at whether that's really a viable option. Some of the biggest challenges are actually associated with the fact that it's a bulk material, and the location where mines is not necessarily the location where cities are, which is meaning there's a large transportation cost between those two locations. But it certainly is something that is used currently in the market. When I renovated my home, I used a geopolymer that was from iron ore tailings and fly ash, so the ash that's left over from a power plant, in the concrete of my home. So the concrete of my house is already recycled material. So there's already stuff in the market that you can find that source. And finally, another source is potentially reusing the building waste. So when a building or a footpath or a road ends its life and is demolished, there are ways of recycling that material for other uses in the construction sector. That is commonly not a normal part of that process, but certainly there are opportunities there and that we should look into those in more meaningful ways. So I'll leave it there, Georgie, and perhaps invite Jim to maybe make some brief intervention here or add some points in the chat box.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And if I can invite you as well to please send in that good practice of using sand alternatives, so we can make sure we include that. And so now if I would like to give Jim the floor, please, Jim, it's all yours.
Yeah, Danielle has very expertly, in fact, answered that question already, that there are several ways of replacing sand, primarily by crushed rock, moving away entirely from sand per se, and recycling. Yes, in several countries, particularly in Europe, up to 20% of the primary aggregates can be replaced by recycled materials. Though, as Daniel said, there are always the logistics and how close these sources are available to where the sand and gravel is actually needed. So there are plenty of technologies also using manufactured sands, as I mentioned earlier, which are the crushed fines from producing crushed rock, stone. So there are many ways of gradually replacing sand, if you like. And, ultimately, there is no need, there should be never any extraction of sand from pristine beaches or beaches anywhere. There is no justification for that because there are other sources, ideally, as I said, from crushed rock, fines, and so on. And equally, in some countries, river extraction is pretty well unavoidable because there aren't geologically hard rock sources round about. But again, that can be done in the right and responsible way. And it's so that there are plenty of good case studies showing the way. And certainly we as GAIN are very much behind that and fully support all that Daniel has been doing. And his home is a good example of the right way of doing things. And of course, to connect back to the previous question, where there is extraction, that must be permitted. And I'm talking generality now. And, the environmental impact assessment and the opportunity for all stakeholders to comment is inherently part of that process. And perhaps if in some countries that democratic function is perhaps missing, I think that is something that could be brought forward again into the UNEP conclusions, that that there must be greater transparency and accountability and opportunity for the wider stakeholders to comment and raise questions and if necessary to actually block any projects that just do not make sense in terms of responsible extraction. So I hope those comments help, and thank you for the comment, the opportunity to intervene again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jim, for that response. I would now like to give the floor to Laura from the Government of Switzerland. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Georgina. I would like to pick up on the issue of sands and tailings because they seem to be particularly salient also across the regions, the different regions. They are explicitly addressed in the resolution and they keep being discussed during sub-regional consultation and again today. And I would like to make the link with the third question on what further step could the international community take. We heard interesting suggestions from the sub-regional consultations that UNIA could play a role analog to the ILO and develop minimum standards for the environment. So I would like to throw two questions around to the floor and seek participants' views. The first is on sand and gravel. do participants see any potential for international cooperation on this? For UNEA to work, for instance, towards the development of minimal standards that would help to also ensure a level playing field on this? And the second question is on tailings. We have seen these new global tailing standards, which have been praised for its comprehensiveness, but also seem to have some limitations. The standards is obligatory only to ICMM members, and if not mistaken, only to active mines. So do participants see any role for the international community to further build on the standards, to further develop it and perhaps expand its application and seek to address, for instance, non-active mines, as an example? So thank you very much, and thank you very much for your insight on this.
Thank you, Laura, for posing those questions. And please do request the floor, any of the participants, if you would like to respond to those questions, or if you would like to add any comments. We still have approximately 20 minutes in the session. And I would invite you to use this opportunity to please share your perspectives and your success stories as well as your concerns. I would now like to give the floor to Rahul, who will respond to an intervention made by Australia. Rahul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Georgina. Let me just find my... Yeah, there was a discussion about how Australia was doing very well in terms of its mineral management. And I just wanted to show, we've been talking, I spoke a lot about loss and zero loss. Now, these estimates are, the Australian numbers basically are from the Australian government. And what this means, when we say an estimated loss rate of 82%, what it means is, if minerals worth, let's say, 150 was sold and the cost of extraction plus a normal profit for the extractor were 50, then the mineral worth would be calculated as 100. Against this mineral worth of 100, the Australian government as owner received only 18. So regardless of meeting all environment standards or, even like following all the royalty rules and all of that, if the rules itself are set that you get only 18 for minerals worth 100, effectively that is imposing a per head tax on every single Australian and handing over this 82 to the extractor. And it also effectively cheats future generations of their wealth. This, of course, happens from the entire way of accounting, because if you think of revenue, you don't think you're losing something. So that's a separate point. But I do want to make the point that there are enormous losses around the world. These are a variety of studies, and I've already shared the presentation, so you can see the link to where this information is from. So you can go in and we can do this analysis everywhere else, but this is an important issue to underline. I've already a couple of other questions I've answered in the chat, so you can look at that. One was around deep sea mining and the environment, and one is a little bit around what India is doing in terms of sand mining, the guidelines India has already created. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that intervention. And I would now like to give the floor to Professor Franks to respond. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Georgie. I just wanted to add to that comment that the Australian government itself did a study in around, I want to say, 2008 to 10, looking at windfall profits and how it might respond through greater taxation. I noticed, Raul, that most of your graph there corresponded to the period of early 2000s to 2010, and everyone will know that that was actually a period where there was very high prices for minerals, and a period in which some people call it a super cycle. We are not currently in that period now. So I think if you did take a broader time period, the numbers wouldn't be so stark as is in your table, because, for example, iron ore during that period of time was around $150 a ton. Now it's down around 60. There's a huge difference there. And iron ore is where Australia, for example, makes most of its export earnings. So certainly it's definitely an issue around resource taxation, and the Australian government used something similar to what you just argued as a way to argue for stronger taxation during that boom that was happening. Now we're not in that boom. It's a bit harder for governments to make those changes and arguments, but nonetheless it's an issue. But perhaps a broader time period would come up with some different figures to what you presented. Thanks, Georgie.
Thank you, Daniel. So, distinguished representatives, excellencies, we have approximately 10 minutes to continue to make interventions to the floor. I would like to again provide this opportunity to any participants who have not yet made an intervention to please request the microphone. On the bottom of your screen, you will see a button that has request to speak. So please don't hesitate to make that request. We will now also follow up with some further questions that have been posed. And these are things that have come up throughout the sub-regional consultations. We have spoken to some length now about sand mining. We've also touched on the issues of seabed mining. And Jane provided a fairly in-depth intervention around the issues of the involvement of CSOs, Indigenous groups and local communities in the governance of extractives. This is an issue that has been raised a number of times throughout the sub-regional consultations. There have also been examples that have been raised about the role of CSOs and local communities in the monitoring of mines and creating multi-party, multi-stakeholder groups that can be involved in that monitoring process. So I would like to also invite any of the representatives on the line who work with civil society and represent NGOs, local communities, to please provide their further insights on these components of mineral resource governance. This is going to be an area of the report that will be submitted to UNEA 5. So at this stage, I do not see any further requests to take the floor. Let me just check.
Can I just make one intervention on this UNEFI? Georgina,
please go ahead.
Just in terms of a lot of extractive companies are listed publicly and of course benefit from loans and things like that. And again, fit and proper person test is something that we should be asking investors and lenders to these companies to be looking at to see if they actually are have a clean record, or are they instead actively participating in either looting countries or destroying sort of the planetary commons.
Thank you very much for all of those interventions and links. It has been incredibly rich to supplement the sub-regional consultations that we have held with today's discussions. And so with that, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished representatives, we are now at the stage where we will close this regional consultation. But before we end our conversation, I would like to now turn to Professor Daniel Franks for his final reflections. Please, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Georgie. Thanks again, everyone, for an excellent discussion. We focused a lot today on some of the issues that we'd already discussed, particularly around sand. I thought the discussion around aggregates and sand was very good, but we certainly would appreciate heaps more case studies in that area. Thanks for the links that we saw in the chat box around different guidelines that are available. I'm really interested in receiving some more interventions around that particular topic. I noted the suggestion to place intergenerational equity at the heart of the UNEA Mineral Resource Governance agenda. And that was originally put forward by Raoul, but also seconded by Jane from the Asia Indigenous Peoples Network on Extractive Industries and Energy. There was also some good discussion around the need to move beyond just the sand agenda being about the impacts of river extraction to an agenda about how we can source materials that are needed for construction and how best to do that. One thing perhaps we didn't discuss today, but I think is vitally important, is in shifting from informal sand mining to informal sand mining to formal quarrying that requires machinery that usually employs less people. There's a huge human development challenge and transition that needs to be thought of very, very carefully, particularly around issues to do with informal sand miners, because those sand miners are often doing that activity out of circumstances of poverty, and there's literally millions of people involved in that supply chain. So in making those transitions to alternative sources, we need to really think about the human development challenges and implications associated with that. And also to be very careful about how we describe those circumstances. Again, today we heard the term sand mafia, whereas in many contexts, in majority of contexts of sand mining, it could not be described as a situation of a mafia, as in implying that those sand miners are in positions of power. Often informal miners are actually not in positions of power, and it's only in very rare circumstances where they are in positions where they can manipulate the market or impose their activities on the state without an ability to regulate. Some really good interventions as well about FPIC, and we didn't mention, but the relevant United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that provides the foundation for free, prior and informed consent. We heard from Jane the need for nation states and the international community to support the implementation of FPIC principles and standards and see through those into practical strategies for agreement making and making sure that Indigenous peoples are really involved in projects throughout the whole life cycle of those projects. We had some good discussions about seabed minerals and whether the processes that is ongoing at the International Seabed Authority is really representative in capturing the global community's perspectives on that topic. And there's some good comments in the chat box that we were able to collect on that topic. And I think I'm going to leave it there, Georgie. There was probably lots more to discuss, but there's some of the takeaways that hit kind of the top of my list. And I look forward to seeing you all in the global consultations that we'll be having, the global forum we'll be having in September, where we bring all of the regions that we've been consulting together. We've done more than 20 consultations by that stage into one event, so we can see how the things that we've discussed at the Asia Pacific region can connect with or differ from other regions. So I encourage you to do that. Also, we're still receiving submissions, written submissions, video submissions, and the survey until the 28th of August. So there's still a little bit of time for you to put something together. Short, sharp, concise submissions are the best way to get your material across into the process. So we encourage you to do that. In doing that, what we haven't been hearing, but what we'd love to hear, is what activities, what actions, what work can we do at the international level through a cooperative process across member states to continue this mineral resource governance agenda going forward. We've heard a lot of things that are kind of broad ideas that can impact local, regional and nation state level. But what really can member states come together on to cooperate? And we've heard some ideas, but we certainly would love to hear more. So if you could really highlight that in any future submissions that you wanted to make. Thank you once again for being part of this really robust and interesting conversation. Thank you, Georgie and others. Thank you for Laura and the government of Switzerland for supporting this process. Look forward to the conversations going forward. Thanks, Georgie.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for those remarks. And before we finish, we have had another request for an intervention. So for our final intervention, I would now like to give the floor to Fariz. Fariz, please do turn on your camera and unmute your microphone. Thank you.
Hi, Georgina. Thanks. I'm Faris. I'm from Malaysia. I just want to share what we did, not for the whole country, but one state in Malaysia is called Selangor, nearby Kuala Lumpur. So our business model, we have mitigate a lot of things for all the issues raised, speaking about environment, the illegals, the mafia things, because about more than 10 years ago, the mafia is controlling the sand activity in this region, because the production output is equivalent to more than 60%, because the development is centered in this region, Kuala Lumpur side. So I think maybe on the latest stage on our session, we can share the business model of how the government, the state government mitigate those issues, of which we are the company that has been created by the state government to control all the operators, of which the permits must go to us as the government company. So we are dealing with all the technical departments with regards to the environment, the local community, the social impact, the EIA, and ingenious people also we are dealing with. And speaking about the tax, it's called royalty. We managed to almost more than 90% secured for all those productions. We have developed a new system. Every lorry must register. They have to have, we call it docket. We also digitalize the system. I think on another session, maybe we can share this business model, how we have able to mitigate more than 90% of the illegal sand mining activities. Just for record, in this region of Selangor, we are managing more than 80 oversights of rivers. But the river, we are controlling the river. We do not aim for volume production. River just for the sake of maintenance of river. So we take out the sand to maintain the river. But we focus sand on the mining sand. We have not yet go for the manufactured sand, M sand, because we still have plenty of land that we mine for sand for the construction industry. That we have, all those we have the rehab plans, of which we are creating the water reservoir for the public consumption, and we are moving forward into green energy as the rehab plan for the mining sites. So that's all from me. Maybe I can share to UNEC about how our business model mitigate those issues, illegal and environmental impact in this region, Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fariz. And yes, I do very much invite you to please make a written submission and share those good practices so that they can be included in the report to UNEA 5. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished representatives, with that, we will now close this session. If you have any feedback or questions on any aspects of the information that have been presented during this consultation, please do feel free to contact us. The email address has been shared in the chat box. We very much look forward to welcoming you to the Global Forum, which will be held later this year. It will be held similarly using the Kudo virtual platform, which allows for simultaneous interpretation within the UN languages. Please do not forget to register for that session by sending an email to us or visiting our webpage, which is www.greengrowthknowledge.org. And that webpage will also be shared in the chat for you. Once again, can I say thank you very much for your attention, for your active participation, for all of the interventions that we've received. This has been a very rich discussion and has been very well welcomed to supplement the work that UNEP is doing on mineral resource governance. I hope you have a fantastic rest of the day and thank you again. Goodbye. Some of the issues that have been raised in the financial included, as you have mentioned, issues around seabed mining and participation of community members in minerals extraction industries. So I want to ask, please reinforce what are the significance of this region in why have these particular issues been raised in Asia Pacific, and what are the similarities in the background?